Section 27, page 133. Chapter 20. Of course, we must dine with Mrs. Carfrey, dearest, Archer said, and his wife looked at him with an anxious frown across the monumental Britannia ware of their lodging-house breakfast table. In all the rainy desert of the autumnal London, there were only two people whom the Newland Arkers knew, and these two they had sedulously avoided, in conformity with the old New York tradition that it was not dignified to force one's self on the notice of one's acquaintances in foreign countries. Mrs. Archer and Janie, in the course of their visits to Europe, had so unflinchingly lived up to this principle, and met the friendly advances of their fellow travellers with an air of such impenetrable reserve, that they had almost achieved the record of never having exchanged a word with a foreigner, other than those employed in hotels and railway stations. Their own compatriots, save those previously known or properly accredited, they treated with an even more pronounced disdain, so that, unless they ran across a shivers, a Dagonet or Mingat, their months abroad were spent in an umbraker tete-a-tete. But the utmost precaution are sometimes unavailing, and one night at Boston, one of the two English ladies in the room across the passage, in parentheses, whose names, dress, and social situations were already intimately known to Janie, had knocked on the door and asked if Mrs. Archer had a bottle of liniment. The other lady, the intruder's sister, Mrs. Carfrey, had been seized with a sudden attack of bronchitis, and Mrs. Archer, who never travelled without a complete family pharmacy, was fortunately able to produce the required remedy. Mrs. Carfrey was very ill, and as she and her sister Miss Harley were travelling alone, they were profoundly grateful to the Archer ladies, who supplied them with an ingenious comforts, and whose efficient maid helped to nurse the invalid back to health. When the Arkers left Boston, they had no idea of ever seeing Mrs. Carfrey and Miss Harle again. Nothing, to Mrs. Archer's mind, would have been more undignified than to force one's self on the notice of a foreigner, to whom one had happened to render an accidental service. But Mrs. Carfrey and her sister, to whom this point of view was unknown, and who would have found it utterly incomprehensible, felt themselves linked by an eternal gratitude to the delightful Americans who had been so kind at Boston. With touching fidelity, they seized every chance of meeting Mrs. Archer and Janie in the course of their continental travels, and displayed a supernatural acuteness in finding out when they were to pass through London on their way to or from the States. The intimacy became indissoluble, and Mrs. Archer and Janie, whenever they alighted at Brown's Hotel, found themselves awaited by two affectionate friends who, like themselves, cultivated ferns in Wardian cases, made Macmerlays read the memories of the Baroness Bunsen, and had views about the occupants of the leading London pulpits. As Mrs. Archer said, it made another thing of London to know Mrs. Carfrey and Miss Harley, and by the time that the Newland became engaged, the tie between the families was so firmly established that it was thought only right to send a wedding invitation to the two English ladies, who sent, in return, a pretty bouquet of pressed alpine flowers under glass. And on the dock, when Newland and his wife sailed for England, Mrs. Archer's last word had been, "You must take May to the see Mrs. Carfrey." Newland and his wife had had no idea of obeying this injunction, but Mrs. Carfrey, with her usual acuteness, had run them down and sent them an invitation to dine, and it was over this invitation that May Archer was wrinkling her brows across the tea and muffins. "It's all very well for you, Newland, you know them, but I shall feel so shy among a lot of people I've never met. And what shall I wear?" Newland leaned back in his chair and smiled at her. She looked handsomer and more Diana-like than ever. The moist English air seemed to have deepened the bloom of her cheeks and softened the slight hardness of her virginal features. Or else it was simply the inner glow of happiness, shining through like a light under ice. Weir, dearest, I thought a trunkful of things had come from Paris last week. Yes, of course, I meant to say that I shan't know which to wear. She pouted a little. I've never dined out in London, and I don't know, and I don't want to be ridiculous. He tried to enter into her perplexity. But don't English women dress just like everybody else in the evening? Newland, how can you ask such funny questions when they go to the theatre in an old ball dresses and bare hats? Well, perhaps they wear new ball dresses at home, but at any rate, Mrs. Carfry and Miss Harley won't. They will wear caps like my mother's and shawls, very soft shawls. Yes, but how will the other women be dressed? Not as well as you, dear, he rejoined, wondering what had suddenly developed in her Janie's morbid interest in clothes. She pushed back her chair with a sigh. That's dear of you, Newland, but it doesn't help me much. He had an inspiration. Why not wear your wedding dress? That can't be wrong, can it? Oh, dearest, if I only had it here. But he's gone to the Paris to be made over for next winter, and Worth hasn't sent it back. Oh, well, said Archer, getting up. Look here, the fog's lifting. If we made a dash for the National Gallery, we might manage to catch a glimpse of the pictures. The Newland Arkers were on their way home after a 3 months wedding tour which May, in writing to her girlfriends, vaguely summarized as blissful. They hadn't gone to the Italian lakes. On reflection, Archer hadn't been able to picture his wife in that particular setting. Her own inclination, in parentheses, after a month with the Paris dressmakers, was for mountaineering in July and swimming in August. This plan they punctually fulfilled, spending July at Interlaken and Grindelwald and August at a little place called Etretat on the Normandy coast, which someone had recommended as quaint and quiet. Once or twice in the mountains, Archer had pointed southward and said, "There is Italy," and May, her feet in the gentian bed, had smiled cheerfully and replied, "It will be lovely to go there next winter, if only you didn't have to be in New York." But in reality, traveling interested her even less than he had expected. She regarded it, in parentheses, once her clothes were ordered, as merely an enlarged opportunity for walking, riding, swimming, and trying her hand at the fascinating new game of lawn tennis. And when they finally got back to the London, in parentheses, where they were to spend a fortnight while he ordered his clothes, she no longer concealed the eagerness with which she looked forward to sailing. In London, nothing interested her but the theatres and the shops, and she found the theatres less exciting than the Paris cafés chantants, where, under the blossoming horse chestnuts of the Champs-Élysées, she had had the novel experience of looking down from the restaurant terrace on an audience of coquettes, and having her husband interpret to her as much of the songs as he thought suitable for bridal ears. Archer had reverted to all his old inherited ideas about marriage. It was less trouble to conform with the tradition and treat May exactly as all his friends treated their wives than to try to put into practice the theories with which his untrammeled bachelorhood had delighted. There was no use in trying to emancipate a wife who had not the dimmest notion that she wasn't free, and he had long since discovered that May's only use of liberty she supposed herself to possess would be to lay it on the altar of her wifely adoration. Her innate dignity would always keep her from making the gift abjectly. And a day might even come, in parentheses, as it once had, when she would find strength to take it altogether back if she thought she were doing it for his own good. But with a conception of marriage so uncomplicated and incurious as hers, such a crisis could be brought about only by something visibly outrageous in his own conduct. And the fineness of her feeling for him made that unthinkable. Whatever happened, he knew, she would always be loyal, gallant, and unresentful, and that pledged him to the practice of the same virtues. All this tended to draw him back into his old habits of mind. If her simplicity had been the simplicity of pettiness, he would have chafed and rebelled. But since the lines of her character, though so few, were on the same fine mold as her face, she became the tutelary divinity of all his old traditions and reverences. Such qualities were scarcely of the kind to enliven foreign travel, though they made her so easy and pleasant a companion, but he saw at once how they would fall into place in their proper setting. He had no fear of being oppressed by them, for his artistic and intellectual life would go on, as it always had, outside the domestic circle. And within it there would be nothing small and stifling. Coming back to his wife would never be like entering a stuffy room after a tramp in the open. And when they had children, the vacant corners in both their lives would be fulfilled. All these things went through his mind during their long, slow drive from Mayfair to South Kensington, where Mrs. Carfry and her sister lived. Archer too would have preferred to escape their friend's hospitality. In conformity with the family tradition, he had always travelled as a sightseer and looker-on, affecting a haughty unconsciousness of the presence of his fellow beings. Once only, just after Harvard, he had spent a few gay weeks at the Florence with a band of queer, Europeanized Americans, dancing all night with titled ladies in palaces, and gambling half the day with the rakes and dandies of the fashionable club. But it had all seemed to him, though the greatest fun in the world, as unreal as a carnival. This queer cosmopolitan movement, deep and complicated love affairs, which they appeared to feel the need of retailing to everyone they meet, and the magnificent young officers and elderly dyed wits who were the subjects or the recipients of their confidences, were too different from the people Archer had grown up among, too much like expensive and rather malodorous hothouse exotics, to detain his imagination long. To introduce his wife into such a society was out of the question, and in the course of his travels no other had shown any marked eagerness for his company. End of the section, page 138.